Okay, let's start. Hello and welcome. Thank you for having me at NDC. I'm Poornima Nayar. I'm a freelance .NET developer based in Berkshire, UK. I do a lot of work with Umbraco, and I've been an Umbraco MVP for the past 2 years. Non-work me, I spend a lot of time with my little girl, who is 6 years old. I spend a lot of time reading, mainly fiction, and as much as I have a passion for new technologies, I have a passion for Carnatic music, and I'm learning Carnatic music as well, the vocal part of it. That's my Twitter handle should you wish to connect with me. So today's topic is how I can use Umbraco Hardcore, which is a headless CMS. And I have a catalog of content in my CMS. I'm using the GraphQL endpoint and giving a front-end meaning to my content using a Blazor standalone app. So we won't be building the GraphQL endpoint. We'll make use of what Umbraco provides us with. It's bound to give you a starting point on how you can achieve this thing. So it's a principle that you can take ahead. I'll show you 2 approaches on how to achieve this, but you can always build on top of it. If you want to post your questions to the Slack channel, I can take a look at them at the end of the session because there's much to get through. So what I have as the catalog of content is a sneak peek to the Wizarding World of Harry Potter. I love Harry Potter, and I wanted to include it in my talks at one point, and I think this is the right opportunity. So I've got a catalog of content about the Hogwarts houses, the books about Harry Potter, and some of the famous/infamous characters in the Harry Potter world, and I'm bringing that to a Blazor app. Let's have a look at what GraphQL, Umbraco Hardcore, and Blazor is all about. Then we'll discuss some of the technical aspects and the features that I've used to bring together the single-page app. So GraphQL is a query language. It's a syntax to ask for your data. And of course, there's a server-side runtime to fulfill those queries. And it's a layer on top of your existing data. So you might have an entity framework code database. You could have a REST API, and GraphQL can be a layer on top of that. And the most powerful aspect about GraphQL is that it gives the clients or the front-end developers or the app developers to ask for what they need, and they get exactly what they want. They don't get anything more than what they want, or they don't get anything less than what they want. This makes it both the API as well as the app or the front end to iterate and develop and progress at its own pace. They are standalone, isolated system without conflicting with each other. What did GraphQL try to solve? Overfetching and underfetching. So GraphQL was introduced into this world by Facebook. They had an issue with their iOS and Android apps back in 2011, 2012, whereby a lot of data was constantly being pulled and asked for over the network. This led to mobile devices being sapped out of their battery life, the apps crashing, and mobile bandwidth being used up. The reason being, Facebook app, upon the loading, it was reaching out to get the user information, using a part of it, discarding the rest, then going out and seeking more and more data. So overfetching is that scenario where the app or the client fetches a bunch of information, uses a part of it, discards the rest. Underfetching is the opposite, whereby a client doesn't have the data it needs at any point of time and then keeps polling or keeps hitting other APIs for more and more data. That in turn leads to overfetching because the client might be using a part of it and discarding the rest. So it's like a cascading multitude effect, which led to Facebook quickly thinking or rethinking their strategy. They came up with this technology called GraphQL, or a layer for GraphQL. And instead of having 1,000 different endpoints doing one thing at a time, this endpoint was a single smart endpoint, and all it took in was queries. It was what the client was asking for. And the endpoint would do nothing but massage the query, massage the data that comes out of the data layer, and present it in the same existing format to the client. So the client specifies the data that they need, and the server responds back with the data in the same format as they asked for. So let's have a look at a query. Here I have a query which says, I want a query, and the query is, I want to get the user with the ID 123457, probably a fictitious user, And on that user, I want the name of the user. I want to know the events that the user is interested in, but I don't want a list of events. I just want the count of the events. I want to know friend suggestions, but I don't want all the suggested friends. I just want one suggested friend. And for that suggested friend, get me the name of the suggested friend. And I want to know the mutual friends between this particular user and the suggested friend, but I don't want the names. I just want the count. So as you can see, it would have been probably a multiple list of orchestrated calls in REST API world, which has been condensed into a single query with my GraphQL query. So that is the power of query language. The client decides to ask for what they want. And what they get is a hierarchical JSON response, which is exactly a mirror of the query. So if you look at the data, the query and the JSON response are identical. It's a mirror, except that the query is a string. It looks like JSON. It's not JSON. But what I get is JSON, which can be deserialized and used in my app as and when I need it. Let's talk about Umbraco Hardcore. Umbraco Hardcore is a headless CMS. Based on the open source .NET based CMS Umbraco. It's a headless robot. It's a content store. You can store your content and give your brand an omni-channel presence, which means the same content can be used to power websites, IoT devices, chatbots, etc. So this gives your consumer a seamless but cohesive experience as a brand. And I've been working a lot with Umbraco CMS. It's a huge part of my daily job. And integrations like this is what excites me in the Umbraco world, which is why I chose the topic for the day. Umbraco Hardcore, you can create a project, and the project can be created using the cloud portal. We have a GraphQL API for the Hardcore project, and that's what we are interested in today. With GraphQL API, you can read the published content, which is ready to face the world, as well as draft content. Note that with the GraphQL endpoint, you cannot post data back into the CMS. For that, you would have to either use the CMS itself to edit the content, but we do have this classic example in the wide world where you might want end users to say post something into the content area using an API, and that can only be provided by the REST API. So it's a knowledge nice to have. Talking about what Blazor is briefly, it is a single page application framework from Microsoft. So I, as a C# developer, is a happy bunny because gone are the days when I have to pick up a framework like AngularJS or Vue.js to build a single page application. No, I can do that all using native C#. And it is nothing but .NET Core running in your browser. Yep, when I say that, I think I'll be the first one to bite into that scoop because I can build rich interactive UI using C#. There are two hosting models for Blazor. One is the Blazor WebAssembly, which helps you create what is called a static standalone apps. And my approach is based on the WebAssembly model today. For me, the WebAssembly model is what brings out the best of Blazor because all the .NET dependencies, all the DLLs are downloaded into your browser and it runs from your browser thread as well. So you might be wondering what the performance is like. The performance is on par with any other system out there because the DLLs are so small. And if you're concerned about the security, it runs from within your JavaScript sandbox. So it is as secure as anything else can be. There's also the Blazor server model. This is more of a traditional app model where your app is served from the server and you can use an Azure Web App or a SignalR service to host it. And the client to server connection happens over a SignalR connection, which makes the app interactive and rich. Blazor WebAssembly is still young. It was released, I think, in May last year. While as Blazor server was production ready the year before, back in 2019. I think it was shipped with .NET Core 3. Let's talk briefly about the GraphQL type system. This is a server-side detail, but it helps me continue the talk and relate to how Hardcore builds everything up. So let's talk about what a schema is in GraphQL. With every GraphQL endpoint, at the heart of it is called something called schema. Schema is the type system of the GraphQL endpoint, and schema is made up of types. So the first type is object type, which is your data, which is the data that you can fetch using a GraphQL endpoint. So in my example, I have characters, I've got books, I've got houses. Each of these are object types. And with your schema, you're giving a definition to your business model. The next type in the schema is a query type. It's one of those weird terminologies because query is a type in the schema, as well as I use queries to query the data as well. Query is a type used to get the data from your endpoint, and mutation helps you insert, delete, or update data. And then you have the subscription type, again, which is an operation type, which is for pushed updates. So I can subscribe to the updates on the GraphQL endpoint on my data using subscription. Query, mutation, subscription, they are all operation type, but still a schema type. While as object types are more things where I have control of, it's a model of my data. But with every type that you have in here, object type, query, mutation, subscription, these are all made up of fields. And each field can have a return type, which is a scalar or a list or another object type. Let's talk about queries, which are used to get or fetch the data. And as the name suggests, it's used to get or fetch the data. At its simplest level, it is used to ask for specific fields on specific objects. So if I have a character field, a character object, I am trying to get, say, the ID of it, the name of it, the description of it. And that is what query does. It asks for specific fields. What you get is hierarchical JSON response. And usually you do that over a post operation. I mean usually because there are instances or there are ways by which I can query over a get operation as well. But to make things simpler, let's just go with the post operation for now. One of the most amazing facts about queries in GraphQL is that I can query character, a book, a house, all using the same query, and GraphQL doesn't wait for it to complete, one to complete before the other starts. It runs in parallel, so it goes and fetch all the three pieces of data for me and brings me back the response. Let's have a look at a query, a sample query. What you see on the left-hand side is me querying for a character of ID 123. And I'm saying, return me the ID, name, and description. For some strange reason, I've decided to return ID, which is totally not needed there. But what you get in response is a character, Harry Potter, with the description and the ID. And as you can see, the response is JSON and is an exact mirror of the query itself. And as you might have rightly guessed, queries can accept arguments. In this case, I'm passing 1, 2, 3 as the static ID in this case. And it gets me back that exact character. You can even ask for nested data. So a character might have friends, and I can ask for friends in my query as well. So I can ask for ID, name, description. I can ask for friends, but the friends might be other characters, which means the friends is bound to have name, description, and IDs themselves. But what I'm interested is just the name of the friend. So I'm telling, hey, query, get me the character and get me the names of the friends. So it returns me the ID, description, and name as before. And it also decides to let me know of the friends of the character, Ron and Hermione. And it's a list of names that I get back. We have been having static data as the value in here of late, till now. We can generalize it because that's what is bound to happen in the real world out there. So we can generalize it by using variables. There are three things that you need to do to make it more generic. The first thing is to define a variable name and a type. So in this case, I'm saying ID is my variable name, and the variable name is always of the format $ with the variable name. I specify a return type or the type it corresponds to. I'm saying that the ID is always of the type int. And there is a little exclamation mark here by the return type. This is to say that int is this particular return type or this particular ID is non-nullable. In C#, we make types or we make properties or we make variables non-nullable explicitly. In GraphQL, it's the other way. Everything is nullable by default, and we have to explicitly mark it as non-nullable, which is what I've done here. So this query won't execute. It won't even hit the server without that ID being passed into my query. The next thing I need to do is replace the static value with the variable name. So instead of 1, 2, 3, I am putting the variable name in place. And then the query syntax follows as normal till I reach this part, which is the variables. With this, what I'm doing is I'm passing variables as a separate dictionary along with my request. So I pass in variables as a separate dictionary, and inside that I specify my variable name and the value that I pass in. So if you want to use something like Postman to test your GraphQL query, which by all means is possible, you can hit the GraphQL endpoint using a post operation, pass the query as well as variables as JSON in the request body, and it should get back the details, the server response for you. Let's talk about the GraphQL API query in much more detail now. The API is available at GraphQL Umbraco IO, so you can use Postman to test it alongside your query. It's available over Cloudflare, and the data has a caching layer on top of it. So you can see that after the first query, it gets much more faster as well. It accepts a post request, so you can by all means use Postman to test it with a post request, and it accepts a content type of application JSON. By default, the endpoint is not protected. It doesn't require an API key or an authorization header. But what it needs is a header, a custom header called ump project alias. So whenever you set up a project in Hardcore using the cloud portal, what you get to choose is a project alias, and this project alias is your key to querying data in Hardcore and even for support purposes. So the project alias needs to be passed in as a custom header value when you pass your request in. If you choose to protect your endpoint with adding authorization, you can by all means do that using the back office of Umbraco. In such instances, alongside the Umbraco project alias, you either need an authorization header passed in, or you can have an API key passed in as the header. So regardless, it needs the project alias, because the project alias is what gives the whole system a context of where your data is, where you're trying to get the data from. Let's have a look at some of the basic aspects of Umbraco now. So this is my Umbraco back office CMS. So when I log in, I get presented with my content tree. Content is of a tree structure, which means I can traverse the tree using some of the methods that I have, or the fields that I have. So I have a little catalog of content, which is Wizarding World. Then I have my characters, which is like a list. It's like a holder for all my characters. And I've got a fair few characters put up here. I've got the houses, and I've got the 4 houses. I've got books, and I've got the 7 books here. And I've got few pieces of content that I've filled in. So this is the content for my homepage. This helps me build the navigation on the site, etc. And with every piece of content, it has a URL, and the URL is driven by the name that I put in here. So these are called nodes, and the node name, what you put in here, drives the URL. The URL is also driven by the relative position of the node in the content tree. So as you can see, it's already building up a pattern. The slug is made up of the node name, but it also follows the position in the tree. If I go into one of the actual characters, let's go to Voldemort. It again follows that pattern. The slug built by the name of the node itself, and then following that pattern, following the relative position in the content tree. I've got the media, where I store all my media items. And when I fetch data using GraphQL endpoint, Umbraco gives me a fully qualified URL for the media, and it is served over a CDN as well. The settings section is what I might be looking into more, because I'm a developer and this is quite developery. This is where you have what you call the document types or content types in Umbraco. The content types are the blueprint for your content. And the little form that you see here when you open up, which I have filled in, it is all driven by what you have in the corresponding content type. So if I look at the Wizarding World content, it has got different fields. It has got the navigation field, footer field. So a content type is basically a collection of fields, and it is used to define a piece of content on your catalog. If you look here, it says inherited from content base, which means that it is using something else. So this is a case where you have a set of properties which you think is common, or it can be used across a set of other document types. And in such cases, you define a document type like so, a content base, nothing special about it. It's just a regular document type. And what I do is on all the other document types where I want to use it, I go and specify that it is a composition. So in my Wizarding World type, I have added content base as a composition, which is why I get those fields here. So a classic example of what we normally find in the Umbraco world is the SEO properties for a page. So you have the keywords, the title, and the description, which you want to put across all your document types. That's usually done as a composition. So this is a Wizarding World type, and this is the home page, or the home page, the landing page of my catalog of information. And underneath Wizarding World, I'm specifying that I cannot build content types of every other type. I can only specify or build content of book list, house list, or character list. So these are again document types. And if I choose a Wizarding World page, I cannot create content other than any of these types as child items. So I've got my character list here, which is a very simple document type, book list, and house list, again, which is quite simple and inherits from the composition. Having a look at one more content type, say character, it's got another set of fields. And at every level, I'm saying that only a character is allowed as a child of the character list page. A book is only the allowed child of the book list page, and house is only the allowed child of the house list page. So it lets me have my content have a really good structure and a rigid structure. So all my editors can do is go and create another house, create another book, or create another character. So it already lets me have that structure ready for my single page application. Now, these are called fields, or these are called properties of a content type, and every property has an input type, which could be something simple like text string or a rich text editor, or something more complex like the multi-node tree picker. What a multi-node tree picker helps me do is it helps me choose other pieces of content, but I can then limit it to a particular type if I need to be. So appears in is what I mean by appears in is in which books these character appears in. So in all honesty, so this needs to be a book. So this forces my content editor to go down the route of picking a book, and picking a book only if needed. They cannot choose a character or a book to go in place of that. So that is about the back office of Umbraco. Let's have a look at how the schema is generated in Umbraco Hardcore. We have this document types and content specified for us. Now, how does it turn into a schema? Every time I save a content type in Umbraco, a corresponding object type is generated behind the scenes. So when I save this, or when I save a data type, it regenerates the schema. And for every content type that I have in my content type collection, it generates an object type. And every content type has a alias, what you see here. And the name of the object type is the alias in Pascal case. So in this case, my object type would be called character. I have compositions like content base, and such compositions gets generated as interfaces in the GraphQL schema. So like any other system, GraphQL allows interfaces, and it is very similar in concept to the C# interfaces that we have. It's a rule which says that you have this many types. This can implement this particular type. And when you implement this particular type, you need to make sure that you implement all the fields of that particular type. And that's what interfaces lets us do. All the fields in an object type, so let's go back to character. All the properties that you see here gets generated as the fields in my object type. So my character type would have character name, description, character picture, etc. And the data type determines what the underlying scalar or the return type of a particular field is. So let's have a look at the headless section in Umbraco, which has the API Explorer. So this is the little switch if you want to make your API endpoint secure, that is with authorization required. But you have something called the GraphQL playground. GraphQL endpoints by default are introspective, which means you can query the endpoint for its own information. So I've got a little schema introspection query here, which helps me query everything about this particular endpoint. So this is quite interesting because this has given rise to tools like GraphQL Playground, what you see here, or Graphical, which are like browser-based IDEs, which lets you test your queries. So I, as a developer, I don't need to rely on Postman. I can use this IDE to test my queries. And what it also gives me is IntelliSense. So if I start typing in here, it starts giving me IntelliSense, which is very useful. And also, the entire schema of my GraphQL endpoint is available to me for reference. So I can go into a character and see what it does. So the type character implements content. Content is another interface, which is like an object type in Umbraco. And the content contains a lot of fields like ancestors, children, ID, level, name. So these are all common fields, which is common to every piece of content in Umbraco. And it helps me traverse the tree as well. Because at the end of the day, when you query the GraphQL endpoint in Umbraco, what you are getting back is content. So with all the content types implementing this interface, it makes it easier for me to query the content in Umbraco. In addition to this, it also lets me know what the scalars and the return types for each of my field is. And this is an incredibly useful way for me to query my GraphQL endpoint. So other thing to note is that the GraphQL endpoint query, which is the top level entry point to querying your endpoint, that query type has out of the box two fields, which is all content and content. All content lets me query all the content in Umbraco, while as content helps me query a particular piece of content by an ID or a URL. And what it returns me is a content type. When you start building your content types, your document types in Umbraco, additional fields get added to the query type. So if I have a character content type, two fields get generated. One is the character, where I can query a particular character by ID or URL, and all character, where I can query all content of the type character. So that is getting all the list of the items, and the other one is getting just a single item of character. So this querying by URL forms the basis of one of the approaches of my single page application using Blazor. Now let's have a look at what features of Blazor did I use to approach my single page application. The first one is components. So they are the building blocks of Blazor apps. Everything that you see in Blazor is components. Literally, a component is everywhere in Blazor. Blazor components or Razor components are files with a .razor extension. So if you are well versed with MVC, once you get into the component world, it is Razor markup that's waiting for you out there. You can make components routable by using a page directive, which means you can access them using URLs, which is, again, one of the key points I have used in my approaches today. You can be really smart about components, and you can build components which can be reused, shared, created as NuGet packages, and you will see one along the line which I have used in my approaches. Razor components, when compiled, generate C# partial classes with the same name as a component. So if I have a component called character, it gives rise to a partial class called character behind the scenes. And that is a good way of including C# code in your component as well. So partial classes are one way of including C# code. You can use a code directive in the component to include C# code, or you can even inherit from the component base and use that as the basis of your C# code. I have gone with the code director way today because it helps me do everything in a single shot, but you can use any of the other two ways if needed. So what is a single page application? Very briefly, with traditional web pages, I enter a page address into the address bar. It hits the server and gets me all the HTML and JavaScript back. But with single page application, what you achieve is virtual navigation. There's always a smart person called router coming into the scene with single page applications. And what router does is it adds or removes parts of the page dynamically as and when needed. And that's how single page application does the virtual navigation for you. And if you're really smart, after the first time when the application is requested for, it might not even hit the server. It'll just continue to be on the browser. And like any single page application framework, Blazor has a router as well. It's quite a cohesive kind of application. It's quite comprehensive router. It kind of fills you in for all the scenarios that are needed. But you can play around at router level. You can create custom routers if needed. And there are applications in CMSs like Octane, which has got a custom implementation of router. So it's out there for you to play. And the same approach that I'm doing here today, it can be given a totally, entirely different meaning using a custom router. But I'm going with the basics just to make the demo pretty simple. So router in Blazor is a component in itself. And you can find the router in the app.razor. So with the standard Visual Studio template in app.razor is where you would find your app router, and that is your router. What router does is, upon the startup of the app, it scans the app assembly and tries to figure out information about any components that have a route attached to it. And when the end user requests for a particular component or a URL, what the router does is it tries to find a match between the incoming URL and the components it's got awareness of with the matching route template. And in such cases, it passes the control over to the route view and you get served a page or a component. Otherwise, you get a sorry message. And how do you specify routes? And that is done using a page directive, like so. So I have routable components across my app, and this is how you specify a route. And I'm jumping the gun here slightly. You can have route parameters as well. So route parameters can be used to generalize your route. So in this case, I have a route which specifies Wizarding World in characters. And then I am saying that at the end of this particular URL, whatever comes in is to be treated as the character name. So this is how you can specify route parameters, which is, again, a very powerful feature about routing in Blazor. And the way I consume a route parameter is using a component parameter. This is how you specify a component parameter. But when you have a route parameter and you have a component parameter of the same name, a public property of the same name, adorned by the parameter attribute, Blazor treats it as like a match to the or a way to consume the route parameter. So this parameter, this property out here helps me consume the character name that comes in as a part of my URL. You can also have component parameters, which is basically by specifying a public property of any type. And this helps me treat this as a component parameter. And when I use this particular component elsewhere, I get this as a part of my syntax, like so. So if I have a view character with a detailed page component parameter, it becomes a part of my syntax to use that parameter itself. So that's about parameters. That's a very brief take on parameters, but then there are things like route parameters, which are optional, which can be constrained. You can even have catch-all parameters. So just playing with the route parameters, you can have different flavors or different shape to the same single page application. Now we have our Blazor, we have our endpoint. how do we talk to the GraphQL endpoint from my Blazor app? For that, you can use client libraries. And right now, the two client libraries in .NET that I can think of is GraphQL Client and Strawberry Shake. GraphQL Client has been out there for some time, while Strawberry Shake is still in preview. It's from the house of Hot Chocolate, and it's quite a rising star at the moment. It's two very different takes on GraphQL Client, but it's fantastic, so feel free to give it a try. And I've installed these two packages in my Blazor app. So let's start looking at the first approach. Let's talk about the GraphQL client wire up before that. So once you've installed the GraphQL client, it needs a bit of setup. It's .NET Core. So what I specify is a GraphQL HTTP client passing in the GraphQL endpoint and specifying the serializer. I also need a header going in with every request to the Umbraco endpoint, for which I've suggested the project alias and the header. And with adding it as a scoped service, it is now available for me to inject into my components like so. So this is the way of injecting a service into your components in Blazor. So let's have a look at my content structure. I've got a very rigid content structure, and it's in layers. So the first one is the home, which is the wizarding world. Then I have a list of pages, list pages, so not list of pages, it's a list page, books, houses, and characters. And then underneath each, I have a collection of books, character details, and the house details. So which means I can achieve a mapping like this. So what I have done in this instance is I have mapped up each content type to a component with a specified route in my Blazor app. It's a very rigid content structure that I have got. And for this particular scenario, it totally works. So I have a content type called Wizarding World, which I'm mapping to the the index component. And I know that in that particular component, I will only be querying for content type of Wizarding World. So it's easy for me to match up there. But when it gets to the next level, like character list, again, I have a component called characters matched up to the content type character list. And I again know that on that particular component, I will only be looking out for the character list page and content from the character list page. I am letting my CMS drive the URLs of my app, because then it becomes easier for me to query GraphQL endpoint, because I know that I can query GraphQL endpoint and ask for a content based on its URL. So which allows me to do it in a very straightforward, simple manner without having to do any string manipulation. But by all means, you can choose your own ways of doing it. You can take a totally different route, have your component route set up in your own way if possible. But then you'll have to do string manipulation. But this is just to give the idea of what you can do. And I do the same for the book list and the house list. I have a component marked to the content type, and I've got specified routes. For the character, book, and the house detail page, again, I've got the CMS URLs here, but I can see a pattern. So when it gets to the character detail page, I know that what appears at the end of the URL slug in the CMS is the character name itself. So I can make use of that generalization and have the character name as my route parameter. Similarly, in the book detail page, I know that the last part of the URL is always going to be the book name. So I can use that as a parameter. And in the house detail page, I have the house name coming in, and I can use that as the parameter. So I've got set routes for each of the component. And on the component, I can always query for the relative URL and pass that back to the endpoint. And to set things right away from the start, my nav menu is also driven by the CMS, which means that the end user will always be playing along with the URLs, which is driven by the CMS itself. So let's have a look at some of the queries that I have written for this. We'll first have a look at the query for the Wizarding World homepage, and then we'll have a look at the character list and the character page, because from there on, it just follows the same path. So for the Wizarding World page, what I'm doing is on the page, I know that I'll always be querying the Wizarding World content type. So I can, I don't want to query it by passing in a URL because I know that there's only one of that content piece always. And in that instance, I'm querying for all Wizarding World content, but I'm using only the first one. And items is like a connection, or it helps me get the child or the ancestors. It's called a connection in GraphQL. And items is a convenient field for me to query those connected nodes in Umbraco. And for the first item that is returned from this query, I'm querying the headline and the description. And I can get the details like so. And back in my code in the index page, I have the query here. This is one of the annoyances I've got with GraphQL client. There is no nice way to put my query in place. Just for the ease of demo, I have put it in, but in reality, feel free to constant it up, have it in places. I have an object, which is my return type, and I'm using of the own initialized async lifecycle event of a component. So this is the second lifecycle event in the whole lifecycle of a component. And this method, this lifecycle event is triggered whenever a component is initialized for the first time. And this is a good place for me to initialize the data in a component, and I'm making use of that fact. In the initialize method, I need to set up a GraphQL request object, which will be then passed in as the request body to my query. And inside the GraphQL object, there's a query property, and I'm setting the query to be my string query. I don't have any variables, and I can use the send query async method to pass the request to my endpoint and get the data back in deserialized format. And in my Razor markup, I check for whether the data is null because it's an async method. It's considered a best practice. And then I can use regular Razor markup to emit my data out. So that's the index page done. Let's have a look at the character list page. On the character list page, I want to show the description and the content and a list of characters as cards as well. I'm not relying on pagination or filtering or sorting here. The endpoint allows all of that, but this is to provide you the basics. On my characters component of the characters page, I know that I'm always going to be querying for a particular character list page. So if I have the URL, which is already matched up to the CMS URL, I can pass that into my query and get and query that particular piece of content in the back office. So I have my character list query here, and it is accepting a URL variable. And on the character list, I'm asking for headline and description. And now I can start querying the child items of that character list page. So my content structure is home, character list, and content, the character pages. And for a character list page, I have character as the content, the child content. And I've got this children connection in the query field, so I can query the items from there on. And once I get to the items, I know that what it returns is a list of content. As you can see, it's a content connection. It's a list of content. But I know that child items will always be of a character type. So I'm using what is called as inline fragment, which is used to convert interface into its concrete. And then I can query the fields on that. So I cast it to my concrete and get me the URL, the character name, the character picture, and so on. So as you can see, my character has a lot more fields, but I only want to display the image of the character. I want the name of the character. And of course, I want the URL because then I can match up the URL in my app to the URL from the CMS. So I get that information. And in my component, which is here, I have set the root to be so that the URL kind of matches up. And following the same method as before, I have the query and the GraphQL request object set up in the onInitialized async method, but then I need the URL as well. And the URL can be obtained using the navigation manager. It is an injectable dependency, the navigation manager, which helps me provide, it says it provides an abstraction for querying and managing URL navigation. So I can use the navigation manager surveys to get me the relative path. And I need to append a / because Umbraco expects that as well. And as usual, I can query the data, deserialize, and display it, which is this. So if I have a look at the app and what we have achieved so far, we have the home, which is here. It's got, my mouse is a bit sluggish. It's got the heading and the content coming in from Umbraco. And with the characters, I've got the description and a list of characters. And I can click on one and it takes me to the character detail page. And to achieve this, I've got another piece of query, which is here. Again, I'm querying a character by its URL. I'm getting the character name, the character description, and species. When it gets to appears in, I know that what data the appears in returns is a list of content, but I am allowing only editors to choose the books. So I can cast it to a concrete type and get me the headliner URL. But if at some point you choose to allow something like a movie, it would still work. But then you would have to have an inline fragment like on movie or so. Because GraphQL won't error out if you have a content which you cannot cast. It will just continue as usual. When it gets to the house, I know that I'm allowing houses. So I can again cast it to the concrete and get me headline and URL, and I can get the character picture. I'm getting the URL and appears in URL as well, because from the character page, then I can allow my users to go back to the house detail pages as well. And in my component, I have hard-coded the route like so, and I am getting the query and the URL as before, forming the GraphQL request object, sending the query, and from the deserialized object, I am displaying the data as and when I need. So this is one approach of doing it. This works because I've got a rigid content structure, but we can start generalizing it a bit more with my second approach. In this method, what I did was instead of mapping one component to URL, I have one component per level of the content structure. So I have one component for the home page, which is the content, the wizarding world. I have one component mapped to the list page, which is the character list, book list, and house list. And because I know that the URL pattern is quite predictable, I can use the characters or the books or the houses as the list type. Again, with the detail pages, the URL follows a pattern. So I can form a pattern for my route template based on that, with the list type as well as the name acting as the route parameters here. So let's have a look at the query which I use for this. The query gets a bit more generic in this instance because at every level, I am not querying for a particular type. I'm querying only for content. So this is what I used. I used the content query here, which lets me query all content, or any content of a particular URL. I'm passing in a URL as before. Now, when it gets to the list pages, I know they are composed of the content-based composition. So I can try and cast the content-based composition and get the description and the headline. And then I know that the list pages can have the type character list, book list, or the house list. So again, I can try an inline fragment, get me the, and I'm saying that if this is a character list type, then query the children and get me the items as before. And if it's a book list, query the children of the book list item and get me the books as before using an inline fragment. Or if it's in a house list, get me the houses and get me the details of them. And if I pass the query and a parameter here, it should work. Why didn't it work? Let's have a look. It is working on the page. That's what is more needed. So it should get me some data. So as before, I've got the second approach and the second app here. The index page remains the same. It hasn't changed, but the major changes are in the list page and the detail page. I've got the query here, and I am using the URL using Navigation Manager as before, but there is a change in the lifecycle method that I use here. I'm using the set parameters async instead of the on initialized. The reason being, whenever a component is loaded for the first time or requested for the first time, that is when the on initialized kicks in. If the same component is requested with a change in parameters, the on initialized doesn't run. It straight away goes from method number 1, which is set parameters, to the on parameters set async. And so this becomes the right place for me to query data based upon the change in the parameter value. So I know that the incoming route template is of Wizarding World / a list type. So I can get the URL from there, and then I can query my GraphQL endpoint and return the data, which is what I have in my approach 2 here. So if I look at my characters, it should load the characters as before, houses as before, and books as before. And then I can click onto my detail pages. So the detail pages follow the same kind of principle and the same kind of querying, except that it is querying for either a character, a book, or a house. And that query is here. Again, I'm querying on the content endpoint at the content field in the query. I am checking whether it can be cast to a content base, because 2 of my types implement the content base. I'm getting the details. Then I'm saying if it's a book, return me the data about the image. If it's a character, get me all these fields. If it's a house, get me all these fields. And I'm using the same exact principle as before, except for the fact that, of course, the query is different. I'm using the URL, and I'm using the set parameter set on parameter set async, but I'm passing the data using component parameters to the child components. So I get the data back in my detail page object here, and I have all these display views. They're quite dumb views, which just accepts some data and displays it, and that's the path I've taken here. The reason why I chose to do it this way, because upon each of these components, I know what type I'm querying for. It is a content type alias that I'm querying for. And that content type alias doesn't change, because if it changes, the entire schema changes as well. So it is quite a good, solid constant for you to query upon. Of course, you don't need to magic string it. This is for ease of demo purposes that I've done it. So the nav menu follows the same path. I have the nav menu in the Wizarding World node. I'm querying for this particular field in the Wizarding World node and getting the data out and forming the navigation as well. The code is in GitHub, which you can see, and as you can see, it works. You can even have links to external pages, which I've done, and it works. It's a simple test that I've done. So if I go back into my character list page, I've got some setup here. Let us try and publish a character and see whether that works. Let's see. There you go. We have Helena Ravenclaw. So that's how it works. So it publishes content and it gets it in. Currently, the order of display is the order of display or the order in which the items appear in the CMS, but you can have filtering on it, you can have sorting on it, the way you want it, but that is onto the next level, I feel. One thing when we think about single page applications that always comes to our mind is SEO. And there is a way to tackle SEO in Blazor as well. And for it, I have made use of this package called Toolbelt Blazor Head Element by Jay Sakamoto. There is also extensions package from Microsoft, which is in preview. It's not production ready, but this package which I've used helps gets it ready for both server-side Blazor as well as WebAssembly Blazor. And if you look at the code, it is actually components Sakamoto has written to provide us with this facility. So it needs a bit of wiring up in the program CMS, program.cs, by adding the head element helper. And once it is done and the imports are in place in my imports.razor, so this is where you can control all the common imports for your Blazor app. So the imports is in place. It helps me have a title page on a per component level if you want. So for ease purposes, I have used the character name on the character page or the house name on the house page. But what you can do is you can have even the SEO coming in as separate data from the GraphQL endpoint. So that is my little take on Blazor's single page applications using a CMS. But you can rethink your routing strategy, you can rethink your query, and you can come up with totally fluid single page applications. I can think about a complete set of different ideas in approaching this. You can even play at the custom router level and make the entire thing dynamic if you want. All sort of opportunities are there for us to research and try on and experiment on. So these are some of the resources from today. I'll have a look at the Slack channel and see if there are any questions, but otherwise I would consider this mission accomplished. No questions, I think. So that's it from me. Thank you.